Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, the Diplomatic Academy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation has invited you to another, already the 8th, meeting with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergey Viktorovich Lavrov. Today's round table is devoted to the topic related to the events in Ukraine under the general title of the Ukrainian crisis: the failure of the cancellation culture. Dear ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency, good afternoon. We appreciate our dialogue on, first of all, the Ukrainian topic, but we remember that during such meetings, issues related to other crises are also touched upon, which the West is trying to ignore and hush up against the background of persistent, aggressive actions to Ukrainize the agenda of any international forum. But we will start, as always, with Ukraine. We have already met for the 8th time. To be honest, I thought that the figures were more modest, but nevertheless, we discussed the problems of militarization of Ukraine, the problems of rewriting history, information wars within the framework of such round tables. Today, we have proposed the topic of cancellation culture, which, by and large, is all-encompassing and not only concerns Ukraine. Maybe not so much Ukraine, because the West began to apply the culture of cancellation of everything that does not suit it, long before the Ukrainian crisis. When parents did not like something for democracy, for the rule of law, they simply cancelled this something. And instead of this inconvenient format for them, the law applied their own rules, on which, they said, the world order should be based. International law has been abolished, sacrificed to the very rules that, as we found out, no one has seen, no one has read. No one has presented them anywhere to the world community, but the West still clings to this slogan. Let's see how the new administration of Donald Trump will act. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said in a recent interview that multipolarity is the reality of today. This is an interesting statement that no one has ever heard from the lips of American officials before. But let's see how it will be refracted in practical politics. The attempt to abolish the norms of international law is particularly evident in the attitude of the West, the United States and their allies, to the Charter of the United Nations. When they apply the principle of self-determination of peoples, as they did in Crimea with respect to Kosovo, when their goal is to support their wards, their detractors like the Ukrainian Nazi regime, then they cling to the principle of territorial integrity, ignore everything that the peoples of Crimea, the peoples of Novorossiya, Donbass did, when in the face of a bloody unconstitutional coup d'état Russians refused to recognize its results and refused to live under the rule of a regime that set out to destroy everything Russian, namely Russian history, Russian traditions, orthodoxy, language, culture. All this has been the life of Crimeans, Donbass, and Novorossians for many centuries. The West is ready to cancel all this. As I said, they only need territorial integrity in Ukraine. Unfortunately, the Unsecretariat, including the Secretary General, is actively playing along with the West in Ukrainian affairs. Despite the requirements of Article 100 of the Charter of this organization, that the Secretariat should be impartial, and not take anyone's position, not receive instructions. There is no one government. But maybe there are no such instructions that are printed on paper. But the fact that Antonio Guterres, his deputies, who represent the United States, Britain, Canada, and other NATO member countries, all of them in leadership positions, say exactly what the West needs. The abolition of truth is another way to try to maintain its hegemony. And a couple of weeks ago, at the UN General Assembly on the occasion of Holocaust Day, the Secretary General, speaking as an example set to him by Western speakers, including at events in Europe, did not mention who exactly liberated Auschwitz. This refers to the Red Army. It wasn't said. There are many other examples when not only the provisions of the Charter are cancelled, but also the decisions of the Security Council, which, in accordance with the Charter, are binding on all countries. Thus, the Security Council resolution was cancelled, which unanimously approved the Minsk agreements, which a year after the coup, already in February of the 2015 year, made it possible to stop the war that the Kiev regime waged with its armed forces, its army against its own people in the Donbas. The Minsk agreements, with our active participation, allowed this war to be stopped, and the Security Council resolution approved them. And soon it turned out that no one was going to fulfill them. Nothing happened on earth. The Kiev regime violated all its obligations under these agreements on Germany and France, which, as they stated, were intermediaries, guarantors of this document, also did nothing. And more recently, both Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Allant, who signed this important document, even said with pride that they were not going to fulfill it. It was necessary to buy time in order to pump Kiev with modern weapons for the war against the Russian Federation. The decisions of the Security Council are also part of the course towards the abolition of international law. This manifests itself in other forms as well. There is, for example, the International Law of National Minorities, a number of conventions, including the Council of Europe. Within the framework of the UN, there is an international legal framework for the protection of minority rights. We have repeatedly recalled this, and the Constitution of Ukraine itself requires this. But in an effort to cross out, exterminate, ban everything Russian, any techniques are used, and no arguments are taken into account. We have already talked at the last round table about the need to look at the root causes of any conflict, as called for by the President of the People's Republic of China Xi Jinping in his initiative Global Security Initiative, where he wrote that any conflict, in order for it to be resolved, it is necessary to analyze from the point of view of its root cause and then work out practical steps to eliminate these root causes. The root cause, which lies in a conscious long-term aspiration, and not only aspiration, about the practical actions of the West, to create direct military threats to the Russian Federation on our borders, on the territory of Ukraine, drawing it into NATO. We have talked about this many times, warned, and demanded from NATO that we still see the fulfillment of obligations, not to expand eastward to the borders of the former Soviet Union, in this case the Russian Federation. All in vain. And suddenly, for the first time, President Trump, in one of his first speeches, criticizing the Biden administration's position on the Ukrainian crisis, bluntly said that one of the main mistakes was drawing Ukraine into NATO, and that if Trump had been president for the previous 4 years, this would not have happened, and there would have been no conflict. This is the first time I am drawing your attention, Western leaders, but the leader, therefore, of the entire Western world, uttered these words, which we in general welcomed. Because for the first time the NATO problem is designated as something that the United States is ready to discuss seriously. Namely, the United States, of course, will make decisions about what will be the position of the West, and, accordingly, the position of Kiev. Let me remind you that in our previous contacts with the Biden administration, with representatives of France, Germany, and other countries, even before the special military operation, when we made official proposals on security guarantees for everyone, including for Ukraine, but also for Russia, of course, we were told, it's none of your business. I personally spoke with Blinken in January of the 22nd year. I urged him to seriously consider the proposals that we have circulated in order to prevent a military conflict in Europe. He told me, it's none of your business, no one can poke his nose into the relationship between NATO and those countries that we want to accept into the North Atlantic Alliance. The reminder that within the framework of the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, political commitments were made to ensure the principle of indivisibility of security, according to which no one has the right to strengthen their security at the expense of the security of others, and according to which no organization in the Euro-Atlantic has the right to claim dominance, were simply dismissed with an argument, as the West has done before did. But these are political commitments. We say, how is it that your president and prime minister signed up in the 2010 year at the summit in Astana? It was reconfirmed because the same commitment was approved in Istanbul in 1999 year. They say no, but these are political commitments, and legal guarantees of security can only be provided in NATO. And they were smiling. In general, the duplicity of hypocrisy has never left our Western colleagues. This, apparently, gives them a certain cheerfulness. So the culture of cancellation was also manifested in the cancellation of the Security Council resolution that approved the Minsk agreements, and, as I have already said, this is by no means a unique Ukrainian method of actions of our Western colleagues. From the culture of cancellation, including the abolition of international law, is manifested especially vividly now with regard to the situation in the Middle East. Decision of the Security Council. A month and a half ago, the necessary basis for actions to create a Palestinian state, recognized by everyone without exception, was simply cancelled. And you know that President Trump said that the Gaza Strip, it is necessary to withdraw all residents from there. And let Jordan, Egypt, they have a lot of land, let them disperse these 1.5 to 2 million people, and we will make a resort out of the Gaza Strip. All this is following other decisions that President Trump made in his first cadence, such as, for example, the recognition of the Dutch Heights as Israeli, and the UN General Assembly and the Security Council made other decisions. These decisions were reversed, and there are many examples of such, including, by the way, Western Sahara. And this trend, according to our assessment, will only increase. I'm not complaining about this, I'm just stating the reality. Reality, of course, diplomats should first of all take into account the facts that are emerging on the ground. And that should be the subject of negotiations. Russian, and we see attempts in addition to the abolition of all Russian, about which Zelensky passes laws. In addition to this, we see the desire of our Western colleagues to abolish everything Russian, too. This is manifested in the ban on cultural events, in the ban on the participation of Russian athletes in the Olympic movement. To the great shame of Thomas Bach and his team. When an outspoken man enters the ring at the Olympics in Paris and beats a woman, this is considered necessary. Because this is how Bach interprets the Olympic Charter. And those provisions of the Olympic Charter that require the rejection of any politicization of sports, Bach interprets in such a way that it allows him to prevent Russian athletes from competing, prohibit the anthem, coat of arms and other attributes of the national team. Another element of the abolition culture is the abolition of justice. This part of the process was particularly pronounced in relation to Ukraine. There were no investigations, no reasons for the organizers of the coup, which crossed out the settlement agreements. And the agreement was guaranteed by the European Union, and the next morning the opposition simply seized the government building. No one investigated the circumstances of this coup d'état, although there are plenty of facts that indicate the preparation. The careful preparation of a provocation with the murder of employees, unarmed law enforcement officers on the so-called Maidan. There are plenty of facts about how these same representatives of the junta that seized power illegally, burned 50 people alive on May 2, 2014 year. There are just videos on the internet of how it happened, and who did it, who set it on fire, who shot, who finished it off. There is no judicial process, no investigation of any kind. The Council of Europe tried timidly to offer its services, adopted some kind of resolution. But the Ukrainian putschists ignored the organization that still had chances for respectful relations with itself at that time. And one of those who burned people in Odessa in the 2014 year, he is now a deputy of the Verkhovna Rada, travels around Europe, demands to punish Russia. So distorted reality is also part of this culture of cancellation, when facts are cancelled, and they do not want to deal with them at all. An outrageous example from the same row is Bucha, when 2 days after the withdrawal of Russian troops from Kiev, in a suburb called Bucha, dozens of corpses were suddenly found on the main street. We talked about it, neatly laid out on both sides of the roadway. There was also a group of journalists from the BBC who accidentally, but quite successfully, prepared a report, which then caused hysteria in the West. Russia was again accused of all mortal sins. Bucha became the reason for another batch of sanctions that the West wants to strangle Russia with, and then we became interested. We have our own facts that prove that there were no Russian troops there at that time. Nobody wants to listen. We are already at a minimum, but for the second year, we have been trying to get the names of those people whose bodies were shown by BBC journalists. Just names. Isn't this a natural step in any investigation of any crime? A stone wall. I personally appealed to Guterres, how to put it mildly. It is not very comfortable for him, as he said, to deal with this issue. I said, do not engage, just ask your authority to publish the appropriate list. We officially appealed to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in September last year. Our investigative committee officially and the Prosecutor General's office officially appealed to this office. Officially appealed to the UN-Secretary General, presented their arguments, which clearly indicate that it was staged. And so far, we can't get just a list of names even, let alone an answer. According to our data, which we receive from those who understand the correctness of our position, in this Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, they do not want to share data on the basis of which this office, or rather, under its control of the International Human Rights Mission in Ukraine, has publicly concluded that this is a crime of the Russian military. And they don't give names. Justice, truth, the abolition of anything. And the same applies to terrorist acts on the Nord Streams, on the Nord Stream, and Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines. Nobody wants to tell anything. Only when we ask the countries that are involved to officially announce the investigation. Sweden and Denmark said they didn't find anything, so they ended the investigation and won't reveal anything about it. And Germany continues to do this, but they do not want to show anything to all our reminders, including in the Security Council. Sometimes an article suddenly appears in the newspapers that sources said that one Ukrainian woman and two Ukrainians rode on a yacht, drank wine, and decided to blow up gas pipelines. This is what all the reputable newspapers write. Speaking about Western journalists, I twice appealed to the professional pride of Western journalists at a press conference in New York about the list of names of Bucha victims. I was interested in why you, representatives of the mass media of the United States, Britain, Europe, Canada, who, for any reason, and for no reason, demand some kind of explanation from the authorities. In this case, you can't even request a list of victims. It will soon be 3 years of this tragedy. So I have no doubt here either that the abolition of journalism, the abolition of information, is also a worthy component of the piggy bank of modern working methods of our Western colleagues. But I'm not even talking about the fact, you know this, that the Russian mass media are being cancelled with might and main, just for expressing an alternative point of view. The West has been fighting dissent for a long time. This dissent, the fight against dissent, reached its climax under the Biden administration, when the forums of democracy against autocracies were convened, when they declared, as Blinken stated, that those who would be against democracy and refused to sit down with Americans at the democratic table would be on the menu that would be served at this table. It wasn't my idea. But not to mention the barrel, who said that Europe is a blooming garden, and there is a wild jungle around. This includes you and me. So the abolition of decency, elementary ethics, this is also firm the arsenal of actions of our Western colleagues. The us, the British, and the Europeans have completely closed their eyes, and they have closed their eyes tightly to the series of laws I mentioned on the abolition of all Russian in Ukraine, education, mass media, culture, on the ban of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. But the OSS decision on the indivisibility of security has been cancelled by practical steps to expand NATO. The agreements that preceded the coup d'état in the 2014 year have been cancelled, the Minsk agreements have been cancelled, as well as Security Council resolutions, including on the Middle East settlement. This is a trend. This is not something that the West is exclusively honing such methods for Ukraine. And we are witnessing a clear desire to cancel our country entirely, as it was in 1945 year, when the Second World War was not over, when the summits were held in Yalta, in Potsdam, when the Allies celebrated victory. Now documents have been published that say that the West was preparing even before the end of the war in the Pacific plans to attack the Soviet Union, to dismember it. Now these plans have come to life. There was another historical epoch, 1991 year, when the Soviet Union collapsed. The West thought that the new authorities, the then Russian authorities, would be in his pocket. It didn't work out. And now some marginals, obviously at the instigation of the West, non-governmental organizers, Russian former citizens who fled to Europe and the United States, began to create structures for the decolonization of Russia. They mention 7 or 8 parts into which our country needs to be divided. So this mentality of canceling everything that you don't like and that is competing with you, it is present. Speaking of competition, fair competition has long been abolished by our Western colleagues, including through the imposition of sanctions. Now Mexicans, Panamanians, Danes, I think, and a number of other countries will be able to feel for themselves what the abolition of competition is. Chinese friends responded harshly, and people who want to dominate, they do not understand another language. But this will be a broader topic, the topics of the world order, the fate of the global system of globalization in general, which the United States created and then took and cancelled when they realized that it was more unprofitable for them. And it is beneficial to those who have agreed to work according to the rules of this system of globalization. Free competition, respect for property, the presumption of innocence, and many other things that were promoted by everyone. Now all this has been cancelled because it no longer works for the interests of the United States, and ultimatums are now working for the interests of the United States. Let's see how it will happen. We have not yet had the experience to look at the new president's team in practical matters. And besides the desire to physically abolish Russia, dismember it, of course, the West has joined the company to destroy Russian influence in the international arena. Ukraine is extolled as a beacon of human rights and European values. Among the values that Ukraine promotes under Zelensky, let me remind you, are the values of Nazism. When collaborators convicted by the Nuremberg Tribunal are exalted as national heroes. This is also a European value, it does not surprise me. And the fact that neo-Nazism is raising its head in the West itself, too, we cannot forget. In an effort to cancel everything Russian, as I have already said, they are trying to close tours for us, Russian artists, which have already been agreed with the relevant cultural institutions, the abolition of Russia in sports, all this is doomed to failure. But it is sad that to these attempts, just as the UN Secretariat supports the Western line in cancelling inconvenient facts, and refuses to help in investigating crimes, the Secretariat of such a once respected organization as UNESCO behaves in the same way. The head of this structure, Miss Azoulay, a French citizen, in fact, contributes to the complete Ukrainization of the agenda. Politicizing UNESCO, refusing to fulfill her direct duties, which include protecting the rights of journalists. Do not react to the numerous murders of Russian journalists in the zone of a special military operation. Do not react to how historical memories are being demolished, monuments in Ukraine, including in Odessa. A monument to Empress Catherine II, who founded this city, was demolished. Her monument was demolished, and the monument to Potemkin and all the others who were involved in this project, who built it, who created ports, factories, and generally inhabited these lands for 100 years, their memory is being destroyed. A week after the demolition of the monument to Catherine II, not only Mrs. Ozul did not react to it, as she should according to her professional duties. The historical part of Odessa, where this monument stood and was destroyed, was taken and included in the UNESCO World Heritage List. That is, even here there is some element of a call. Here you wanted to see your Empress forever, but I removed her, or the Ukrainian Nazis removed her there. And I encouraged them for this. Therefore, UNESCO, of course, is in a very deep crisis, but despite this, Russian culture, including through the intergovernmental bodies of UNESCO, is making its way. Last year, at the World Heritage Committee, which met in India, another Russian object was included. Already the 33rd object was included in the list of natural and cultural objects of world significance. These are the landscapes of the Arkhangelsk region. A year ago in Abu Dhabi, we actively participated in the development of a program for education in the field of culture and art. At a special conference, actively participated in the work, did not feel any discomfort, as Miss Zuli and her staff wanted to achieve. We are holding the Days of the Russian Language at UNESCO headquarters, despite all obstacles, on Pushkin's birthday. The Dmitry Mendeleev Prize for Achievements in the Field of Fundamental Sciences was introduced on our initiative. The third contest is now underway. And if we talk about our cultural projects, sports projects, many of your countries participated in the BRICS Games, which brought together a large number of athletes from more than 80 countries. The Games of the Future took place. This is the first experiment to combine physical sports and esports. And the second Games of the Future this year will be held in the United Arab Emirates. You have probably heard how successfully and loudly the World Youth Festival was held. How special events are held to expand student Olympiads. The International Organization for the Russian Language was founded last year, on the initiative of the President of Kazakhstan Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. We have a growing number of students from foreign countries studying in our country. There are already more than 370,000 of them, and this figure will grow. In other words, it is impossible to abolish Russian culture, Russian humanitarian influence, Russian sports. And speaking about the events that we hold in order to oppose the true ideals of sports, culture, cooperation in science. Attempts to Ukrainize existing forums, I draw attention a couple of days ago. The President of Russia signed a decree on holding a song contest, an international intervision song contest, which will provide an opportunity for all countries to show their best musical traditions without any censorship. More than 20 countries have already announced their participation, about sending their representatives to the jury of this competition. And I am convinced that this will be another opportunity for another platform for interaction of artists from many countries of the world. Such a unique music expo in its own way. We will be glad to see your countries among the participants. I guarantee that there will be no perversions and mockery of human nature, as we observed during the Olympic Games in Paris. But in conclusion, I want to come back from what I said when I was talking about the commemoration of the Holocaust victims. When even the UN-Secretary General was ashamed to name the facts about who liberated Auschwitz. Now there is a big company, in an attempt to undermine the reputation of my country, whitewash the Nazis. By the way, on this day dedicated to the memory of the Holocaust, the representative of the European Union avoided the word Nazism in general, the word fascism did not utter. He called Hitler-era Germany an authoritarian state. Just as Russia, the People's Republic of China, and a number of other countries represented here are now called. Therefore, the attempt to blur and, in general, destroy the memory of that historical truth has a rather serious calculation that the whole West will rally around this idea. We won't let that happen. This year is being held both in Russia and in the Commonwealth of Independent States under the sign of victory in the Great Patriotic War. Victory over Nazism. And we are planning a large number of events. We expect that we will inform you about these events in a timely manner so that you can take part in them. The main date is the 9th of May, when the Victory Parade will take place, and many invitees have confirmed their participation, including all our friends, neighbors, allies, and CIS countries, and from many other countries. I do not know, maybe I overused the time that the organizers set aside for the opening speech, but if something was wrong, I hope you will understand me.